Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us for the webinar this evening, which is being hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name is Chloe McKee and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on making good silage back to basics. Our presenter this evening is Siwan Howatson. Siwan is a dairy scientist at AHDB focusing on grassland and forage. Siwan is from a mixed farm in North Wales and is also in her final year of studying part-time for a master's degree in ruminant nutrition at Harper Adams. The plan of action for this evening is that Siwan will take you through a 35-minute presentation and then there will be some time for questions at the end. You will all be muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question or at any time throughout the presentation if you think of a question, then please type it into the box on the right-hand side of your screen. When Siwan has finished presenting, I can then ask her those questions. There's over 170 people registered for the webinar this evening, so hopefully we won't encounter any technical difficulties, but please bear with us if there are any. So without further delay, I will hand over to Siwan for this evening's webinar.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Chloe, for the introduction. So as Chloe mentioned, tonight we're going to be focusing on making good silage, and we'll be covering back to basics on various factors involved in making good silage. There are many management decisions to be made, including when to cut, how to store, and how to feed silage. And during this webinar, we will aim to cover these key decisions you will need to make from now to feeding out to make sure that you're producing high quality forage for the winter feeding period. Before we dive into these points, I would like to spend a few minutes just setting the scene for why we are focusing on making good silage and why it's important to aim high. There we go. So, as we all know, grass is the most important yet often overlooked resource for livestock production. Well-managed grasslands provides the economic feed throughout the year, either as graze grass or as silage. The total production cost is cheapest for graze grass, coming in at 97 tonnes per dry matter, followed by grass silage, and then in this example we are discussing first cut, which comes in at 128 pounds per tonne dry matter, followed thirdly by your purchase concentrate. In this example we're talking about a crude protein concentrate of 18%, coming in at a total of 227 pounds per tonne dry matter. With a cost of production of per litre of milk or per kilogram of live weight gain a major consideration for all livestock producers, it is crucial that we optimise the use of these homegrown forages. By optimising the utilisation of homegrown forages, we can reduce the reliance on purchased feed, which then increases overall net profit. The principle for improving homegrown forage utilisation from graze grass and conserved forage is based on the typical grass growth curve and the livestock feed demand through the year, which is demonstrated here. So the green line is the grass supply through the year, and then the blue line is your livestock feed demand. Depending on system, this will vary between farms, but the principle is that as various times of year in the year, we will have a demand greater than the supply of grass available. So you can see with these two arrows that in the winter months, we have a greater demand than grass supply on our farm. But at peak time, when we've got peak grass growth during the year, we have a greater grass supply that overtakes animal demand. The key is to manage the surplus of grass growth at peak to have a good forage to feed during the winter period, so where the arrows are here. Done well, grass silage can provide high quality forage for winter feeding. As we've previously mentioned, grass silage is the second cheapest feed source available to you on your farm, but it's not cheap to produce silage. So it's important to take into consideration and take the time to work out how much it costs to grow, make and feed silage. This will help you make decisions about future feeding regarding whether cheaper alternatives can be bought in or whether different crops should be grown to fit your farming system and business plan. So in this example here, we are looking at the cost per hectare. So in the first graph that I showed you, we were talking about tonnes per dry matter. This is talking per hectare. So we're looking at a first cut of 40 hectares of grass silage with a D value of 68. Rental value, so everything grown on farm carries a rental value, and the £250 a hectare a year is the standard figure that is used. The reseeding cost here is for the establishment. So for example, the average cost of reseeding is £250 a hectare. And if we take on average a 5-year lay, this equates to £50 a year. It is recommended that you allocate 40% of this cost to first cut silage, including weed control. You also need to take into account your inputs, so your fertilizer and slurry applications. And also, if you're doing this for crops such as maize, it's important to include sprays and plastics, etc. if used. You also need to take into account the machinery. So most contractor operations are easy to allocate on an area basis. Use the contractor price guide if you make your own silage. There's also other costs, including additives, sheeting, and analysis of silage. And these are probably recorded on a per clamp basis. So simply divide the total of area going into the clamp to get that figure. So you can see that in this example, we have got a total per hectare of £491, but this doesn't take silage losses into consideration. But it's still a significant amount of money, and why it's important that we do go back to basics to make sure that we do improve our silage making process. So the first step in having high quality silage is to grow good grass. So it all starts with having adequate soil fertility and structure and selecting the right type of grass varieties for silage making when reseeding. So I'm not going to go into detail about these two areas tonight, but for more information, have a look at AHDB resources such as healthy grassland soils and the recommended grass and clover lists. Good grassland management prevents the grass plants from entering the reproductive stage where they throw up seed heads. With silage, we aim to optimize the amount of heading so that the nutrient content available, in particular digestibility and energy, is correct for the type of livestock that will be fed on the silage. Grass varieties have different heading dates, which are triggered by different temperatures. For example, if you have an early heading grass, that will start growing at lower temperatures earlier in the spring. The stage of growth at which the crop is cut will have more influence on the feeding value of the silage than any other factor in your control. Grasses are classified according to heading date. So this is the date on which 50% of the ears in fertile tillers have emerged. Choosing a silage mixture that contains grasses with similar heading date is key. Details on heading dates are available for the recommended grass varieties in the recommended grass and clover list available on AHDB's website. There is a tricky balance to achieve between producing low yields of high digestible young grass and high yields of mature stemmy herbage with low digestibility. So this would be your low D value over here, where this younger grass here is more leafy and has a higher D value. The targets that you decide for your farm will depend on the type of stock being fed. And just on that note here, just want to take you through this example. So it's key that we do take time to set targets before we harvest. So ask yourself, what is the group of stock that you're wanting to feed with each silage? Think in terms of quality and quantity required as well. So from this table, we can see that silage quality under good has a high D value at 80, high energy at 11.5, and a crude protein content of 16. This type of silage would be suitable for finishing stocks or ewes carrying twins or triplets. If we compare that to the low silage quality, you can see that there's a lower D value, lower ME, and lower crude protein. And a silage of this quality is more suited for dry stocks, spring calving, suckler cows. So that is the difference in the qualities that you need to take into account when you decide what kind of silage you need to be producing. High levels of perennial broad-leaved weeds such as dock and thistles can reduce silage yield and quality. So it's typically said that 20% weed infestation can reduce grass yields by at least 20%. So it's definitely worth taking a look and doing that assessment to see if you need to be thinking more about your weed control. Effective herbicides take up to 3 weeks to get into the roots, so it's important to plan spray dates and balance ideal growth stage of the weed for treatment with your cutting date in mind. It is key as well to use targeted products wherever possible and ensure the weed is actively growing and follow the manufacturer's recommendations. Applications of inorganic fertilizers can boost the nutrient status of grassland. However, the value of nutrients contained in organic manures, which have been deposited by animals or spread mechanically, should be taken into account before any purchased fertilizer is applied. So optimum pH for grassland soils for grazing or silage is 6, according to the recommendations in RB 209. It is recommended as well that you do lime up to 6.2 to make sure that this optimum pH is maintained and not reduced over the years. The reason we have an optimum pH around this level is that this is at the pH where we have the most good balance of the available nutrients. So you can see that in this red box, we have the optimum amount of these elements available to us. Very low or high soil pH will reduce the amount of nutrients available to the plants. Studies have demonstrated that increase in soil pH up to a pH of 7 can increase the maximum yield response we get. So you can see the green line here is grass and the blue line is grass and clover. So you can see on the grass up to a pH of 7, we do get a yield response by increasing pH. However, it is important to remember to take into account what the financial return on investment will be on building up pH past the optimum point of 6.2. So just to touch on the target indices for grassland soils, so this information will be available on your latest soil analysis reports, and it's key to have this information ready to be able to work out your fertilizer applications for your silage fields. So low soil P and K levels below these target indices can reduce yield and quality of silage and also cause a poor N fertilizer response. Fields that are regularly cut for silage have a higher requirements for P and K due to the crop offtakes and the lack of animal returns to the soil. For example, if we take 1 tonne of fresh silage with a 30% dry matter, this contains 2.1 kilograms of P and 7.2 kilograms of K. So you can see there that there's a need for additional K, especially when grass fields are cut in a multi-cut system. Also remember when you're working out your fertilizer recommendations that you need to remember about catch of K if your soil indice is 2+ or below. If you're running a 1 or 2 cut systems, it's important to apply an extra 60 kilograms of potash per hectare after the last cut or by the autumn. If you have a 3 cut system, apply an extra 30 kilograms of potash per hectare after cutting. Sulfur is another essential element that we need to maximize grassland yields in both grazing and silage fields. And sulfur deficiency is becoming a lot more common in grasslands, especially in later cuts or where high rates of nitrogens are being used. Until the 1990s, there was plenty of sulfur available through the atmosphere. But since we've been cleaning up the atmosphere, we are seeing a lot more grassland soils becoming deficient in sulfur. Analysis of uncontaminated herbage sampled just before cutting is a useful indicator of deficiency. It can also be seen in grass when you have the yellowing of the younger leaves in the lay. So it's critical to look at the nitrogen to sulfur ratio, and you need a ratio that's greater than 13:1. There are some soils that are more prone to being deficient in sulfur as well. And if you see a sulfur deficiency, it is recommended that you apply 40 kilogram of product, a sulfate-containing fertilizer, at the start of growth before each cut of silage. Grassland can utilize 2.5 kilograms of nitrogen per day. So that's around 2 units of nitrogen per acre per day under ideal growing conditions. So this can come from soil nitrogen, manures, and inorganic fertilizer. The average amount of N fertilizer applied on UK beef and sheep farms is between 40 and 60 kilograms per year. Clover and manure can also increase this amount. So too much nitrogen produces grass with low sugar levels, and the resulting silage can have high ammonia and butyric acid levels, making it less palatable. But too little nitrogen will compromise yield, as demonstrated in this graph, and the protein levels can be low. It's important to carefully consider whether N fertilizer applications are either too low or too high in advance of harvesting by taking analysis of your fresh grass. The return on investment for fertilizer nitrogen compared to bought-in nitrogen in the form of high-protein supplementary feed in the winter is at least 3:1. Just a few points to remember. Don't apply slurry or muck within 6 weeks of cutting due to possible contamination, and fertilizer practices should not cause swards to lodge, as this will reduce yields and can compromise harvesting efficiency and quality through soil contamination. So that was a quick overview of the factors that you need to have in mind to firstly grow good grass. We will now move on to look at the choice between storing silage as bales or in clamps. The choice between storing silage as bales or in clamps depends on your farm and your management system. Both systems have a place, and a mixture of both is often beneficial on farm. With either option, management is key to making both systems cost effective. Bales are often seen as expensive, but their value and their flexibility cannot be underestimated. So you can see in the table here, we've got the positives seen in green, and then just a point to consider in red as well between both kind of systems. So it tends to be quicker to harvest large areas into a clamp rather than in bales. However, you do need to consider investment in infrastructure, the ability to collect the effluent, and labour and experience to consolidate and sheet properly. These factors can have a big effect on losses and therefore the cost of silage per kilogram of dry matter fed. Bales can be useful to harvest small areas, and it does allow you to have that flexibility. especially if you're also managing a grazing system where a silage cut can be taken from surplus grass on the grazing platform. We also just need to be considerate that the plastic will need to be disposed of appropriately if using bales, and they tend to be that you can have that flexibility as well when feeding out. You can easily target a group of livestock needs with bales. So the ensiling process. So this is not as daunting as of a slide as it might look. So the silage making preserves grass in the lactic acid that is produced by bacteria naturally, that is naturally present on the fresh crop. So these beneficial bacteria allow fermentation to take place. So we start over here. This process also prevents undesirable bacteria and molds from developing. So you can see that the ensiling process starts at the aerobic stage where we have air present. And this lasts a few hours. We then move to the fermentation stage where it begins with no air left. This can then last several weeks. We then move into the stable stage. So when you reach the stable stage, we aim for a pH from 3.8 to 5, depending on the dry matter. Sorry, just go back there. We're then in the storage stage where we have acidic conditions, and then we move into the feeding stage. So aerobic spoilage begins on exposure to air, so when you open your clamp up. A well-fermented silage has a fruity smell and should look bright. This is the aim of the ensiling process. This is what we're aiming for. So making good silage. So we need a checklist to have good silage. So make sure that you have your target and you've decided on if you're going to go for bales or clamp. And also make sure that you know what livestock group you are feeding certain silages to. So this is the checklist for producing high quality silage. So it starts from the cutting dates and goes through to how you prepare the clamp and seal the clamp, or how you bale or wrap and stack your big bales. So for the rest of the webinar, we'll go through these points. Cutting date has a significant impact on silage yield and quality, and the optimum cutting date is influenced by the class of stock the silage will be fed to, as previously mentioned. As the crop starts to bulk up and yield increases, quality declines as the grass begins to produce stems and heads, so going back to that reproductive stage. These are less digestible than the leafy young growth. As a rule of thumb, D value falls by 0.5 units a day when the grass starts to push up flowering stems. Before cutting, the targets that we should aim for include dry matter for clamp silage of between 28 to 32%, and for bale silage is slightly higher, between 35 to 40% dry matter. Aim for crude protein of 16%. Sugars between 2 to 3% in your fresh grass, which equates to between 10 to 15% sugar in the dry matter. And also make sure that you're aiming for nitrogen levels below 0.1%. If you have higher nitrogen N levels than 0.1%, nitrogen can lead to ammonia production, which is alkaline and raises the pH. So fresh grass analysis can be useful to provide you an estimate of these values. However, when it comes to the sugar analysis, it will not resemble that in the field at cutting because it changes considerably from hour to hour and from day to day, depending on the weather. But it's key to remember that our sugars is key for good fermentation. Just want to take a quick look on the benefit of early cutting. So this was research done in 1998, and the early cutting here would now mirror that of a multi-cut systems that we see quite popular. And you can see that the early cutting in both first and second cut produces a crop that is higher in ME than in a conventional cutting system. When we look at the total yield, the multi-cut system produces an overall total higher yield than the conventional system, regardless of the high yield in the first cut of the conventional system. And the reason that we see an overall higher yield is that because we're taking an earlier cut of the grass when it's still in that vegetative state, so in that young leafy pasture state, it recovers quicker. So when we cut earlier, it recovers quicker, producing more growth for that second cut. A weak delay in cutting first cut can cause an increase in dry matter yield of 10%, can reduce digestibility by 3.5%, can reduce ME, so your energy, by 0.6 megajoules per kilogram dry matter, and causes slower regrowth, so the annual yield of your silage fields will be lower. So it is key to have a target for your cutting date and try to stick to it as much as possible. So top tips for cutting. So it's important to include that you're setting up the machinery correctly to avoid ground contact, which reduces the risk of soil and organic manure contamination. So it's important to leave at least 4 centimetres of stubble to avoid soil contamination and to encourage regrowth. It's recommended that you mow when it has dried off and that plants contain higher sugar levels in the afternoon. However, if you know that your contractor is going to be there ready to go at 4 p.m. and that it is good weather for cutting that day, it is better to cut at 10 a.m. in the morning if you know it's going to be picked up at 4 p.m. That also provides that wilting time. But that decision has to be made based on when the contractors will be there, the weather conditions, and also what you're aiming for. Cutting silage in difficult weather conditions is a common issue in the UK, and we do have limited ideal weather windows when it comes to harvesting silage. Last year was we didn't have that issue, but we did have the issue of lack of grass growth. But commonly we do see that weather can cause a few issues when it comes to cutting silage. If difficult weather conditions are seen, it is worth delaying mowing until it's very likely that the harvest can be completed once commenced. Wet crops have to reach a lower pH to inactivate all the undesirable bacteria. Under these conditions, acid additives can help achieve better preservation as they need less sugar to drive the fermentation process. It's also recommended to reduce soil contamination by using multiple field access points and keeping the concrete apron at the clamp clean of soil, and to be prepared to handle high effluent outflow from wet crops in clamp systems. So it's just important to keep those points in mind if you do end up having to cut in difficult weather conditions. So moisture content. Reducing the moisture content of a crop by wilting saves carrying water and reduces effluent. The target dry matter should be, as I've said before, between 28 to 30% for clamp silage and between 35 to, said 45 there, but that should be 40 really. You don't want to get it too dry for Bales silage. Rapid wilting ensures minimum losses in the field and better silage. Long wilt will increase the field dry matter losses and increase the likelihood of aerobic spoilage at feed out. So in the picture here, we've got in the Making Grass Silage for Better Returns manual, there is a guide on how you can estimate moisture content out in the field. So if the dry matter of the forage is less than 30%, it can be estimated by squeezing a handful of the silage. If it's drier, you have to try and make it into a ball, Hold it idly for 30 seconds before suddenly releasing and noting the effect on the silage ball. So you can see the different dry matters here and what you would typically see. You can also take a sample and you can use your microwave to assess the dry matter, but this system can be used quickly out in the field to see if the moisture content has been reached for your harvesting to continue. So good practice for when silage is in the field. So as soon as the crop is cut, plant respiration and the growth of unwanted microorganisms causes the grass to lose nutrients and sugars and proteins start to be broken down. So rapid wilting minimises these losses by quickly creating acid levels that stop further respiration. When silage is in the field, it's important that you do wilt rapidly. So this will mean that rapid wilt concentrates the sugars, allowing a quick and effective fermentation. Wilt as rapidly as possible for a maximum of 24 hours. So crops with high amounts of clover can be wilted for up to 48 hours. A conditioner mower splits the grass, so there's a greater surface area for water loss. This can increase wilting speed by up to 20%. Leave a stubble of at least 5 centimetres, especially if you have poorer weather conditions or if you are trying to increase the time of wilting, and this allows air movement to go beneath the lying grass and help wilt it faster. Spread the crop quickly and over a wide area, and water loss is highest for the first 2 hours after cutting. So ensure raise headers to the right height so they work efficiently and do not pick up soil or manure. So trying to reduce that contamination and just make sure that we are picking up a high quality forage. And then row up into even box-shaped swaths immediately before picking up or baling. So chop length. So chopping grass when it's being picked up or baled results in more efficient silage fermentation because more sugars are released and trapped oxygen we get rid of the trapped oxygen. Chopped material is easier to consolidate in a camp and tends to make denser bales. Chopped silage also breaks down more rapidly in the rumen, leading to higher animal intakes and performance. So it's important to adjust chop length based on crop dry matter to optimize clamp consolidation. Chopping grass when it's being picked up, so it is important that you do go out and assess the dry matter to then have your ideal chop length. So this is the guide for ideal chop length for grass silage based systems. So if you'd like more information on chop length, AHDB Dairy have a webinar with Professor Liam Sinclair from Harper Adams University, 7 o'clock tomorrow night, discussing a recent AHDB funded project looking at evaluating chop lengths for UK grass-based diets. More information on that webinar is available on AHDB's events page. So additives is a question of should I use one? Do I need one? Shouldn't I use one? So the key with additives is that it cannot turn a bad grass crop into good silage. Additives are generally applied when the grass is being picked up or baled via a specific applicator. It is key to always evaluate the use of an additive before buying, considering its effect on forage and livestock performance versus the cost. Follow manufacturer's applications instructions and ask the retailers for independent scientific trials. So there's various additives out there, and for more information on the type, how they work and when they should be used, please have a look in the Making Grass Silage manual here. I'm not going to go into details on these tonight because there is a lot of information there, but this information is available in this manual. So in this section now, we are just going to wrap up by looking in specific at making firstly good silage bales, and then moving on to discussing what makes good clamp silage. So silage destined for bales can be wilted to a higher dry matter. Drier crops are lighter but are more prone to moulds, and they're used less efficiently by livestock. Just make sure that the dry matter is not too high. Modern round balers that chop the crop give high density and good fermentation, similar to that of rectangular bales. So the rectangular bales might be easy to transport, but they need heavy-duty handling equipment because of their weight. So it is recommended that you do put 8 layers of plastic wrap around the rectangular bales compared to 6 recommended for the round bales. And this is because they can be more prone to damage and more oxygen can penetrate the silage than in the round bales. So before baling, it's important to ensure that the baler is well maintained. So aim for a dense, well-shaped bales to produce heavier but fewer bales per hectare, which will reduce the baling and wrapping costs. For a round baler, it's important that you do clean the rollers regularly to avoid buildup of material. Use net wrap that also covers the edge of the bale by 2 to 5 centimetres to help remove lumps and bumps. This will improve wrapping and reduce the amount of trapped oxygen. To prevent soil contamination, check ground conditions and adjust stubble height to minimise the risk, especially in challenging conditions, as I've previously mentioned. When it comes to the wrapping, it's important also to ensure that the wrapper is well maintained. Wrap the bales as quickly as possible, preferably at the store site and within at least 12 hours of baling. If the bales are wrapped in the field, it's important to then move them to the store site as quickly as possible. They should ideally be moved within hours to prevent disturbing the bales once fermentation is underway. Use high quality film with 55 to 70% pre-stretching. Use 6 layers of wrap for your round bales and 8 for your rectangular bales, and just make sure that you handle and store carefully to avoid damage to the wrap. When stacking bales, ensure the site is level and winter access is possible. Follow HSE guidance on stacking bales, which is 1 bale high, you've got 25% dry matter, 2 bales 25 to 35% dry matter, and 3 bales plus 35% dry matter. Bales within the stack retain their quality better than bales outside, so place the best silage within the stack. It's also important to remember to stack more than 10 metres away from watercourses and to use net to help prevent bird and rodent damage. So that was a quick overview of a few top tips to remember if you are making bale silage. So just going to do the same quickly if you decide that a clamp silage system is best for your farm. So time spent preparing clamps ahead of silage making can significantly speed up operations at harvesting as well as improving silage quality. So it's important to give silage clamps an MOT before harvesting by preparing the clamps by removing any old, mouldy or rotting silage and clean the clamps thoroughly. It's recommended to use a side sheet to ensure silo walls are airtight. It's almost impossible to obtain a good seal from oxygen without a side sheet. If you do use a side sheet, you can then also overlap this with a top plastic sheet when covering the pit. Check there is a good effluent drainage at floor level within 50 centimetres of the inside faces. So these are just the figures, depending on dry matter of crop, the amount of effluent released. So most will be produced in the first 10 days after ensiling. Short chop lengths increase early peak flow, and so do acid-base additives. So you need to make sure that your clamps have an effluent storage capacity of at least 2 days at peak flow. If you're in an NVZ zone, silage effluents must be treated as an organic manure, so close period must be followed. In a recent AHDB beef and lamb funded project, 20 farms in England with clamp silages were assessed for clamp density. The figure here demonstrates the variation in fresh matter density across all these farms. So the target in fresh matter is 750 kilograms per meter cube. So you can see that the dashed line here, with the majority of the clamps with density below this. So in dry matter terms, the 750 equates to 250 kilograms dry matter per cube. For more information on this clamp density, you can watch a previous webinar by Dave Davis on the AHDB Beef and Lamb YouTube channel called Improving Silage Making. And that webinar goes through this project in a lot more detail than I have time to do tonight. But one thing that I do want you to take away from this, that is management of clamps is crucial to achieve this target and also to reduce dry matter losses through poor consolidation. To hit this target, keep these tips in mind. So it's important to fill the clamp quickly, spreading the silage evenly and consolidating well. The pressure excreted under the wheels of heavy tractors will only be efficient down to 20 centimetres of depth, so fill the pit in shallow layers. If you're silaging and you're continuing into the next day, sheet down overnight, but do not roll the following morning. If you roll the following morning, this creates a vacuum and pulls more air into the silage, when the aim is to get all the air out. Prevent soil contamination, so make sure that you're cleaning the tractor tyres before rolling and keeping the tipping area clear of mud. Do not overfill the clamp. Compaction above the walls is at least 10% lower than if the silage is level within the walls. And as I mentioned, poor compaction increases the losses in the clamp both during storage and when you're feeding out in the winter months. So when it comes to clamp sealing, it's important to make sure that you seal as soon as possible after consolidation is completed. Cover with 2 sheets of plastic, preferably a thinner oxygen barrier sheet first and a thicker protective sheet above it, or use new sheets covered by last year's old sheet. Put weight on top of the clamp, so this can be done by applying tyres, bales or mats. It's important to make sure that if you're using tyres that they're all touching each other. Ensure that your sheet is not punctured and to protect with a netting if you are prone to having damage by birds. One key thing, if you go for silage, bales or clamp, it's important to measure and record the yield. So record the yield from harvest is a key tool to have to help you improve your production. So this will highlight underperforming fields. And this can be done quite simply by counting a representative sample of bales and trailers and weighing them, just to have an indication of the total yield production. These days, harvesters also have the weighing have a capability of recording yield, so it's worth speaking to your contractor to see if they can offer this service. If you do identify a poor performing field, it is key that you then take action to try and improve this for the following year. So if it does go wrong, just try and find the problem and aim to rectify it going forward. So poorly made silage has a noticeable, unusual, unpleasant smell. So animals won't be keen to eat that, and there is a higher degree of wastage. So there's various indicators if you do have a problem. So for example, if we take the bottom one here, if your silage smells of tobacco or burnt odour, it can be due to poor consolidation. Or if you continue silaging into the next day that you didn't sheet overnight. And also maybe if there was excessive heating in the first few days after sealing, or if the dry matter was too high. So this table is also available in the Making Grass Silage for Better Returns manual, and it can just help you find what the problem is, what the cause was, and just to make sure that that doesn't happen in following years. So my key take-home messages for this webinar tonight is to set targets. So know your silage making targets. Know what quality for each group of livestock is needed and the quantity needed for winter feeding. And also have a target for your cutting dates. Pay close attention to detail at every stage of the silage making process, and this will help you have a high quality silage to feed during the winter period. It's also key to measure yield to help management and improve the use of your homegrown forage production. Investigate your underperforming paddocks and aim to improve. So thank you all for your time tonight, and I hope you have picked up 1 or 2 tips from going back to basics tonight. I will now pass on to Chloe to see if there's any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Siwan. Whilst I'm waiting for some questions to come in, I would just like to remind you all that the presentation has been recorded and it will be available on the AHDB YouTube channels. As mentioned earlier, we have some Better Returns programme manuals that may be of interest, such as making grass silage for better returns, growing and feeding maize silage, and managing nutrients for better returns. So these are all available on the AHDB website along with other resources, and hard copies are available to order. So the first question is, Siwan, going back to those figures you had on the cost of making silage, what tonnage per hectare were those figures based on?
So those figures were based, so that first graph, those figures were based on per tonne. I don't know what the total tonnage were for those. So those figures were taken from an average of quite a few farms, so I'm not quite sure what the overall tonnage were, but that is the figure that is representing to produce tonne of dry matter for your graze grass, your graze silage, and then your concentrate.
Thanks. So you're talking about slurry application earlier. What happens when a sward lodges? Could you describe that, please?
Yeah, so when your sward lodges, it just affects the growth of that sward. So if you're putting too much fertilizer on, it just affects the growth of it. So, so you're just stunting the growth basically by putting too much on there.
Thank you. And also going back to your previous slides when you were talking about an early cutting date, how early is early?
So I was saying before, just before we started this webinar, I was out in Cheshire yesterday and actually driving behind a few silage trailers. So silage cutting is early this year. But in that example, from that research paper, what they mean by early cutting there was your typical multi-cut systems that we'd be seeing now. So your early cutting would be, for example, when you're aiming for 4 or 5 cuts of silage, so you would be starting to cut earlier in the year, and then your conventional that we were comparing to is your 1 or 2 cuts, where your cutting date would be probably later on, end of April, May.
Thanks. Analysing silage, what are the margins for error on the NIRS method and ME and CP results? How much can they vary from the actual ME and CP?
So so taking a silage analysis, it's key to try and get as representative silage analysis as possible. But it is worth keeping in mind as well, when you're recommended to take a freezer bag worth of silage to represent the whole clamp. So it is key to remember that it's only an indication of what's in there, and also it's recommended that you do take a sample for analysis on a regular basis, so every month through your winter feeding period, and adjust your diet accordingly. So NIS is a very rapid, quick way of determining nutritional values of silage. Wet chemistry is a lot more expensive, but would give you the more not the more reliable, because NIS is quite reliable, depending if equations have been calibrated and updated. So I don't know what the error is for your ME and crude protein, but I think the key message is to make sure that you're regularly analysing your clamp and taking a representative sample.
Thank you. Is there more consistency with round-baled silage versus clamp silage because of a more even consolidation within the bale versus clamp?
There is definitely, if you do bale silage well, I think there is less wastage at feed out, especially if your clamp management practice is not up to best practice. But I'm not quite sure on the, sorry, Chloe, can you just repeat the first part of that question?
Is there more consistency with round bale silage versus clamp because of the more even consolidation?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is that sampling bale for analysis is a bit more tricky than your clamp silage, and it is recommended that you do sample more than one bale as well to have an idea of what's going on. But there is quite a bit of variation depending on how they've been handled, how long it's been before you wrap them, before you stack them, and also if the wrap is broken, there's more opportunity for losses to occur. So I don't think you can say that bales is better than clamp. I think they fit different systems, but definitely a mixture of both is very beneficial on farm.
Thanks. In an organic system, would you advise a farmyard manure application after a cut is taken?
Yeah, so you'd have to go back to your soil analysis results. So it's recommended that you take your soil analysis, that you get those done regularly. So it is now a regulation in England that farmers should test their soil regularly, so every 4 years. So take a look at that analysis. Also have a look in the RB209 section 3, so that is the grassland and forage crop section, and that will give you the amount of nutrients that you need to apply depending on your soil indices. So you'll be able to take that from your soil analysis results and then calculate for each cut, depending on the indice, if there's need for application.
Thank you. Is it true that if the weather is settled, that if you cut in the afternoon, you would get higher sugar levels?
So it has been recommended previously that if you cut in the afternoon, that you are cutting at peak sugar levels in that grass. But as I was mentioning, if you know that your contractor is going to be available at 4 p.m, you can then cut in the morning, and you would get, if you've got ideal weather conditions, you can cut at 10 and harvest at p.m. So if the weather's not great, it's better not to cut in the morning, so the sugars will be higher at 2 p.m, and then you would be recommended to wilt for 24 hours to get that sugar levels up.
Thanks. Is it possible to cut a grass reseed within its first year? So would you be able to take a late cut off it in that year, or is it better to wait until the following year?
So are we talking a spring reseed this year, taking a silage cut off that?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So it is recommended with a reseed that just to improve the cover, and it's recommended that you could graze firstly, just so with sheep or if you've got young stock. So just make sure that you do the pull test to start off with, just to make sure that the reseed has taken and it can withstand grazing. And then definitely after that, you could be looking at taking a silage cut. If you have an autumn reseed that you put in last year, there's no reason that couldn't be a very good silage cut this year.
Brilliant, thank you. And what are the rules for cutting when red clover is included in the grass mix? What stage should the red clover be cut at?
So the red clover, so you have a positive with the red clover because it's more aerobically stable, due to I think they say it's due to the higher protein levels. So the problem we have to think about with red clover is think of the preservation rather than aerobic stability. So red clover is generally low in sugar and high in protein, which can make a difficult ensile, but the dry matter you should be aiming for is a minimum of 30%, ideally 32 to 33%, and no more than 35% dry matter, because at that stage we do tend to see leaf shatter being more prone.
Thanks, Siwan. And the last question is, you mentioned sweet smelling silage due to the buildup of yeast. I just wondered how would you prevent that?
Sorry, Chloe, could you just repeat that question?
You mentioned sweet smelling silage, which I think you mentioned because of the yeast. And I just wondered how you would prevent that from happening.
So if I go back to my troubleshooting, so you've got your sweet smelling silage, that's the one you've seen there. So high levels of ethanol produced by yeast plus some acetic acid. So that just comes back to just making sure that you've got your wilting and you're not taking too long, and also that you're sealing your clamp as soon as possible, and just trying to reduce the production of those unwanted microorganisms in there.
Thank you very much. And that was the last question. So just to round up, thank you for that brilliant presentation, and thank you for everybody else at home for listening. I'd like to remind you all again that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available on the AHDB YouTube channels, along with other previous webinars. So thanks again, and have a good evening, everybody.